Hey, what is going on? In today's video, we're going to take a look at yet another script that I had developed in the past. This has been super useful for me. The reason why I want to cover this is because the documentation for the Tenable Security Center API, although it is great, it is lacking in some areas as far as explaining on how you would use it. So I just want to go ahead. I have a few scripts that I want to cover. The time that I have has been limited. So with that being said, I want to get one video out there at least to kind of help those who need it. So today, like I said, we're going to cover this script. This script will interact with the Tenable Security Center API. And what it will do, it will query the analysis to determine what servers are failing the credentialed portion of the scan. So if you have thousands of servers, this will go ahead and query that, the analysis, the cumulative database, and it'll pull all that information in, and it will kind of break it down into a spreadsheet. You could do this in Tenable using a PDF report. For what I have seen, most times, most people want it in a workable format. So in this case, it would be to be used in Excel. So that is what we're going to do. So to start off this video, we're going to go head over to docs.tenable.com/security-center/API/analysis, and that'll bring you to this page here. So as I mentioned in another video, I do not have access to the Tenable Security Center in my lab environment. I have only used this in the workplace, both my last job, my current position. I'm probably going to be using it going forward. So with that being said, I do not have access to Tenable, so I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. So once you head over to this analysis API documentation, this is kind of what we will be using in order to access that information. Like I said, that query of the cumulative database. And when you go through here, you'll notice that it's not really giving us much information. That is because you actually have to, like, this would be the example response. So without any further modification to the request, as seen above, you will get this as your response. This is not telling us much, or if anything at all, with what we need. It does give you some IP addresses and ports and stuff like that. But if you read the note here at the very top, you will notice that this note right here, if the parameter query ID is not specified, the query parameter will require a valid query. This is deprecated. The format of the full query definition can be found in the query section of the API. So what that means is if we go down to this tab here, this is what we will be using in order to get the additional information. So to better explain that, let me provide an example of what the final product will look like, and we'll go from there. So this is going to be the final product. So what it is going to do, like I said, it's going to read the database, the analysis. It's going to pull in the information relevant to what we specify, and I'll explain that in the script as I'm going to break it down line by line. And it's going to pull in the DNS name, the NetBIOS name if that's relevant, and the operating system. This is just an example. Obviously, none of these addresses are real, or the DNS names or the operating systems, but this is just an example of what you will get at the end of it. In my case, in the past, I've seen where a problem has happened, and I came in the next day and I had pretty much all of my scans failing, and I was able to quickly run the script and get a quick idea of what IP addresses were failing, and then based on that, within that subnet, I was able to determine maybe that credential or whatever the case may be was expired or had locked out. It was just a quick way to send out a report and get that resolved as soon as possible. So the next scan, because we run our scans at different times, the next scan could be good to go. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the script, and we'll kind of break it down line by line, as that will probably make the most sense for those that are interested in this topic. All right, so let's go ahead and start from line number 2. So pretty much we are going to import the requests library that's going to allow us to interact with the Tenable API. Pretty straightforward there. Then we have this one, not really needed, although it just allows the processes to be handled more efficiently, or quicker, I should say. From datetime, import datetime and time delta. These two libraries are going to be used in order to process the difference between the current date and the amount of date or amount of days that we are interested in. So for instance, if we are only interested in a particular bit of information within the last 30 days, this is where this will come into play. Then we have JSON. All of the data that we use will be received in JSON and then sent back in JSON. The RE is for regular expression, so we use this in order to pretty much parse out pieces of information within a larger block of information, if that makes any sense. I'll show that later on. The pandas is going to be used in order to manipulate this data and then output it to a Excel sheet. And pandas is great, it's easy to use, so definitely want to get that. That's the only one I believe here that is not a standard Python library that you will have to download. Pretty easy to Google that and get a better idea on how to do that. And then lastly, line 8 is just a way to disable any warnings that are associated with the request library. In this case, if you have TLS or anything like that that's not configured properly, this will go ahead and just remove those warnings so you don't have to get prompted every time you run the script. So let's go ahead and go to line 12. So now we have defined a function. This function is get failed IP. And then in there, we're going to pass through a repo ID, which I will explain at the very bottom of this when this function is called. So to start, you're going to want to define a URL. In this case, we are going to pass through, this is not needed. We don't need an F string. This was used for a previous script. For those that are not familiar, you could use an F. And then if you had to pass through, I might use this later on. I don't even know if it's in here or not, but like a variable here, then you could go ahead and do so, and that will be inside this URL. But in this case, we are not doing that. We are not looping through anything at this time. Actually, I do think we will cover this later on at the bottom of this script. But what you need is to get to your IP address or DNS name of that Tenable API, REST analysis, that is the endpoint, the headers. In order to authenticate with Tenable API, you will need to pass through this header along with your access key and your secret key. That is something that you will need to define within Tenable. Once you go to your users and you right click on that user, you can generate an API key and then you will be given that information. The next piece of information that we're going to be passing through in this request is going to be it's going to be the data that we're going to go ahead and define. So in here, we want to make sure that we say type is vuln. There's a few different types. I think it's like event and stuff like that. That's all within the API documentation if you were curious. And then in there, we want to specify a query. This is kind of not really necessary. Some of this stuff right here is like blank, name, description, context, created time, modified time. So this can be used in order to break it down further, but how I get around it is another way, and I'll show you that as we go on. Again, you want to define type for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but when I removed one, it did not work. Tool, this is a big one. So in my case, the information that I am looking for is specifically related to the IP summary. And in this case, it seems to be the vuln IP detail. So if you go back over to the API documentation, the next piece of information that we're going to be passing through in this request is going to be it's going to be the data that we're going to go ahead and define. So in here, we want to make sure that we say type is vuln. There's a few different types. I think it's like event and stuff like that. That's all within the API documentation if you were curious. And then in there, we want to specify a query. This is kind of not really necessary. Some of this stuff right here is like blank, name, description, context, created time, modified time. So this can be used in order to break it down further, but how I get around it is another way, and I'll show you that as we go on. Again, you want to define type for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but when I removed one, it did not work. Tool, this is a big one. So in my case, the information that I am looking for is specifically related to the IP summary. And in this case, it seems to be the vuln IP detail. So if you go back over to the API documentation and we go into, here, we'll just do this, vuln IP detail. This is, like I said, this documentation is great, although I had some trouble kind of figuring out, because it doesn't obviously tell you every example, but I found one example and then I kind of ran with it to find the other ones. So if you go in there, these are all the different tools that they could use. So it's IP list, list mail clients, list services, list OS. A lot of this is also what you will see when you're actually using the Tenable interface, like through the browser. This is like the summary of CVEs, some DNS name, some family, some ID, some IP. With that being said, the one that I went with, I actually probably could do another one, like a sum IP that I just saw. But in this case, I used the phone IP detail. That gave me the amount of information I needed in order to process this request. Like I said, the source type at the very beginning, we want to set it to cumulative. Another way I think would be like the mitigated. I'm not sure if it says it where it would say it. Either way, like you would see here, here is cumulative. I think it would be mitigated would be the other one. I'm not sure if there's any others. Start offset and end offset, I just set this as high as possible to get the most amount of records back. That seemed to work for me. The next part is pretty similar to Tenable. So if you were to create a filter in any of your reports in Tenable, this is exactly what it would look like. So we are going to do a filter name, and that's going to be plugin ID. A lot of this, again, I just kind of pieced it together by looking at the stuff in here. Here's filter name, and then I kind of found plugin ID, and this was just an example here. Oh, here's another source type archive. So in this case, I was filtering for plugin ID 19506. For those that are not familiar with this plugin, this is very useful to get more information about a particular scan. So it's scanning information, nested scanning information, and in there it will tell you if the credentials are correct or not, or if it passed authentication. So this one you want to filter out for. Next, I want to go ahead and filter out for the repository IDs. And in this case, like I said at the very beginning, we are passing through a repo ID for every time this function is called. So in this case, whatever it may be, this is what we want it to be equal to. The filter name for plugin text. So this is probably the most important piece of this, aside from the plugin ID, is the plugin text. In that plugin ID 19506, we want to make sure that it equals credentials checks equals no. So what that will mean is that the credential check essentially had failed. The credentials that have been provided or were missing are not working as intended. So then you got filter name last seen. So this actually, the time delta, I'm not sure if it's needed here. I can't remember if it was needed in this script or not. I might have just carried it over from another script, because in this case, the filter name last seen, this would be between now and 30 days ago. This is all also in the documentation. Pretty straightforward there. Again, we define the source type, the sort field by severity, and the descending for this guy here. So that's pretty much everything you need in order to get that information. So now we actually want to perform that request. So we're going to go ahead first. We're going to just perform a get request and pull in all that information. So we're going to send it to res. So request.post, and then the URL, headers equals headers, verify equals false, data equals json.dumps. So what this is doing is it's passing through that URL at the very top that we had defined. In there, it's going to have the headers that we had defined for the authentication. Verify equals false. If you have it on true, it will do some verification for TLS, and if it fails, obviously you will get some errors. Data equals json.dumps. So this is going to go ahead and turn that data into a JSON format, and that's what we want to go ahead and do there. Then down here, so then we're going to go ahead and define the data variable, and we're going to go ahead again convert it to JSON. I think this is redundant. I don't think I needed this, if I remember correctly. But this all works. I did test it not too long ago, and everything worked. But I think this is just redundant when I'm saying JSON.dumps data, and then data equals res.json. Down here, so this is what you're going to do. So you're going to go ahead. The input that comes back from this request is going to go ahead and be in a nested. It's pretty much like a nested list. So you want to kind of go ahead and break it down. The way I usually do it is I kind of go one by one. This is not a good example of it, but like if I did print data response, this will give me the piece of information within that nested list of response, and then so on and so forth with results. So what we're doing here is we're saying if the length of this particular nested piece of the list is greater than 0, go ahead and perform these actions. So we're going to go ahead and set a C to 0, which is, in my case, I use it as a counter. Then we have the OS type, so equals blank, because this is going to be set every time here down at the bottom. These repo IDs are all specific to your environment. These are all just fake IDs, test examples. But in this case, if repo ID equals 59, we're going to go ahead and set that OS type to Windows 2019, and so on and so forth. And then we have the failed IP list. So this is going to go ahead and pretty much get that information from that nested list. So in this case, we're going to look at data, response, results, the very first position in this response, hosts, the very first position in this part of the list, and lastly, the IP list. So what that's going to do is going to give us a IP list that meets all that criteria. And then we're going to go ahead and define a blank list here. And then so we're going to go ahead and loop through that failed IP list. And then we're going to put that into this filtered failed IP list. So for I in failed IP list, we're going to do the following. IP equals failed IP list counter IP. It's kind of hard to explain. I wish I had an actual pulled up here. What we could do real quick just to kind of show you here. Let me do this in a PowerShell or Python terminal. 1 second. All right, so here's a good example of this real quick, because I don't think I was doing a good job at explaining that, as I do not have that information pulled up in front of me. So I went over and I went to ChatGPT and pretty much had ChatGPT generate an example nested JSON list in Python. So in this case, I just pasted it into example data. So let's say we wanted to go to, say, print example data, and we want the very first record or whatever we want in that example data. That'll give us server name, server 1, DNS name, server 1, and so on for server 1. But if we go ahead and go to, if we want to take it a step further, so within that first position, we wanted just the server name, for instance. We now have server 1. So that's exactly what is going on here. So for this nested list JSON, it's going into data, pulling out each of these individual IP lists, which within each of this nested list. I hope that makes more sense by providing an example. So what we're doing right here is pretty much exactly the same thing. So IP equals, so this is going to be 0 at the very, because we're setting it to 0 at the very beginning, and we're getting that IP address, so the very first IP address, and then we're going to get the very first DNS name and that BIOS name, and then we're going to go ahead and append it, and then we're going to add 1 to C. So as the loop goes on, it goes into that next position. So in this case, it'll be 1 1 1 2 2 2, and it'll grab it all until the there's no more information in that failed IP list. Last but not least, we're going to go ahead and return that filtered failed IP list. And then that's where this all comes into play down here. So before we get into this down here, I know some of you are going to yell at me with this whole, someone made a YouTube comment about how it's not following like Python standards, PEP 8, whatever it was. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm not developing a script for a large organization with security requirements or anything like that. I'm simply developing Python scripts that interacts with an API to get the information as quick as possible. That's all it is. It's nothing going to be, it's not perfect. Obviously, I could put some more comments in here to kind of at least provide better documentation for myself and for those that ever take over this script in the future. But this is just for learning purposes. I hope you're able to take something away with it. So let's go ahead and continue on with this. So here we're going to define the few more variables. So Windows 2019, these are going to be the repository IDs associated with each in that order. Same thing for Windows list. So we're just going to pretty much add same thing for R9, R8, R7, and R6. for Windows list and rel list, we're just going to go ahead and pretty much create a combined list. So now we have all of these within Windows list. And then we're going to create a combined OS list that combines both the Windows and the rel list. Then we're going to create a final Windows list, just a blank list. And then we're going to say for OS, or for operating system inside of combined OS list, we're going to go ahead and want to, this doesn't need to be tested anymore. This is when I was playing around with it. We're going to go ahead and want to run the get failed IP function and pass through the OS, or this would be the repo ID. So as you remember, here at the top, repo ID, that is what's going to get passed through. And in this case, we're saying whatever is being passed through here. So for each OS in this combined OS list, perform this function with that repository ID. If test is not none, go ahead and append that. So if this result, which comes from here, is not none, go ahead and append that result to the final Windows list, which we defined here. And that's pretty much going to be it. And then we just kind of did some string, string manipulation? I forgot the exact term, to go ahead and get this on nested. This is going to be used so we could use it in our pandas. So here we're just going to go ahead and define a column. So IP, DNS, NetBIOS, and operating system. Then we're going to go ahead and say df equals pd.dataframe on nested data, which we just had developed here. Columns, we want to define that, and that's going to go, so we're passing these two through this function here within PD. And then we're going to go ahead and say df to Excel, and then we're going to pass through the file name and index equals false, and that's pretty much it. And then you will be left with that Excel sheet. And then you will be left with that Excel sheet that we had discussed earlier in this video. Like I said, I hope you were able to take something away. I think that for those that are pretty deep into Tenable and ever want to use an API, you definitely should, as it could speed up a lot of your processes, especially for those processes that you do on a daily, weekly basis. You're going to go ahead and want to use that API. I've even gotten a lot further with my API scripts than this, and I will cover that in the future. This is just one example, and I think it is a good example to get started with looking at the documentation and building reports, especially for like the C-suite, or just the management level people that are going to be viewing these reports. A lot of the times they want to be able to go in here and like filter out, obviously. So instead of building it in a PDF report and they can't really do anything with it, go ahead and now they could filter it out and say, oh, okay, Windows 2016 servers, these are the associated servers, send it to this team because of theirs at DNS name, whatever the case may be. But it's definitely worth your time to kind of learn it and play around with the API within Tenable. Also, like I said, this is not a professional script. This really shouldn't cause any harm to your environment. I don't see anything in here. This is just performing a post request. It's all internal, nothing crazy. So if you went ahead and copied this, you should be fine. Again, I don't want to take any responsibility for what you do in your environment. This is just an example of what you could do. Make sure you read the documentation and you go by what Tenable says. This is not by any Python standard. I hate to kind of cover that a million times, but I've seen a few people get upset about it. That's not what my scripting is about. I'm not a professional programmer or scripter. I just try to get the job done as fast as possible, and I do try to make it as efficient as possible as well. It just may not be pretty. So with that being said, I hope you were able to take something away. As always, never stop learning.